Yes, hello everyone, and thank you very much, Deborah, for inviting me to come along and give a talk about my research. As you said, we were supposed to do this a month ago, but unfortunately Storm Eowyn had other plans, so I'm delighted to be able to come back a month later. So I was asked to give a talk about my PhD research on late medieval parish churches in the north of Ireland, which gives me the delightful job of attempting to condense 4 years of research, 80,000 words and another 1,300 pages of appendices into about 45-50 minutes. But I do like a challenge. So where to start? I'm going to take you to a village near me. Welcome to the village of Donaghcloney. For those of you who don't know, it's between Banbridge and Lurgan. It's one of those places where it isn't exactly anywhere, but it's handy for everywhere. Just putting it out there. Donaghcloney has a graveyard, and in that graveyard, as you can see, is a bit of old crumbling wall. Doesn't look like much, and most people who visit the graveyard completely ignore it. But that bit of wall is the last vestiges of Donaghcloney medieval parish church. Now, if that one bit of crumbling wall was all I had to study, it wouldn't be much of a PhD, would it? Fortunately, we've got more evidence than that. The name Donaghcloney comes from the Irish Donacluna, which means church in the meadow, and Donna was one of many Irish words for a church, but it specifically refers to churches from the 5th to 7th centuries, which means Donaghcloney has had a medieval church for over 1,000 years. We also have records for Donaghcloney in the late medieval period. It's taxed in 1306, and we have another record of it in 1427 when the vicar was robbed. 22 cows and 3 oxen stolen from the vicar of Donaghcloney. Now, this is just one example of a church in my PhD, but it serves to illustrate one of the key points of my research as a whole. There are lots of forms of information about medieval churches out there. We've got archaeological, documentary evidence, place names, and so on. We have a lot of evidence. The challenge is bringing all of these different strands of evidence together, but the rewards are definitely worth it. So when and where are the church sites we're looking at today? The when is roughly the 13th to 15th centuries, or 1200 to 1500 AD. Why did I pick those dates? It's quite simple. Some scholars have looked at the churches pre-1200 AD, some scholars have looked at post-1500 churches. Nobody's really interested in the churches in the middle, and that's where I come in. I think the late medieval churches are the most interesting of the lot. As to the where, yes, I think the talk was called Ulster, but my PowerPoint says north of Ireland, and that's because it's not quite Ulster. So back in the 12th century, there were a number of reforming synods within the church which established fixed ecclesiastical territories, provinces and dioceses, and then eventually parishes. As you can see on the map, Ireland ended up with 4 ecclesiastical provinces. We're focusing on the ecclesiastical province of Armagh. It has 11 dioceses, but we're interested in the northern 7, the dioceses of Armagh, Clogher, Connor, Derry, Down, Dromore and Raphoe, which is roughly equivalent to Northern Ireland plus Donegal, Monaghan and Louth, but minus the bottom bit of Fermanagh, so apologies if anyone is from the south of Fermanagh, I haven't looked at your area. Now, what did this look like in practice in the medieval period? Kind of like this. This is my best attempt to reconstruct the medieval parish network in the north of Ireland in these dioceses. And you'll notice that the eastern areas tended to have smaller parishes and lots more of them, whereas western regions like Raphoe diocese, which is the purple on the left, had much larger parishes. So example, Down diocese, which is the yellow, had 58 parishes, whereas Raphoe had 29. I want you to keep this in mind, the idea that east has more parishes, west has fewer, because that will be important in a few minutes. Now, of course, churches were not in isolation. They were a part of medieval life, medieval society, which means studying them requires knowing a bit about who's who in medieval Ireland. And in medieval Ireland, who's who changes rather a lot. The situation in the north is changing even before we get to 1200 AD, as the O'Neill and the MacLachlan battled for dominance. The O'Neill were eventually victorious, and we've also got the emergence kind of in the end of the 12th century coming up to 1200 of other Gaelic lords, such as the Maguire in Fermanagh and the O'Donnell in Donegal. Now, combined with this, we have John de Courcy and his forces coming up in the late 12th century, taking control of what was the Kingdom of Ullid and creating what eventually became known as the Earldom of Ulster under Hugh de Lacy. So what the north of Ireland ended up with was roughly an east-west split, with the east and northeast mainly under the control of the Anglo-Normans in the Earldom of Ulster, and the western areas remaining Gaelic lordships. Now, it doesn't stay just like that for the next 300 years. We have invasion in the 14th century by Edward Bruce from Scotland, and then the Black Death, which weakened the English settlement so it contracted. So by 1500, we've got three smaller areas of English control. We've got Carrickfergus and its hinterlands, the Ards under the Savages, and Dufferin under the Whites. And then Gaelic lordships had changed as well by the time we get to 1500. The O'Neill split into two sects, so we now have the O'Neill in Tyrone and the Clancyboy O'Neill, who had pushed their way into former earldom lands in North Down and South Antrim. And added to this mix were the Scottish Gallowglass, who had originally come over as soldiers working for some of the Irish lords, and a few of these families began to establish their own lordships, such as the MacDonnell and the McQuillan in Antrim. So by 1500 AD, we've got a mixture of Gaelic Irish, Scottish, and English territory in the north. And these politics matter because the church, particularly the parish churches, were never in isolation in their surrounding landscape. They were the central focal points of the landscape, and so studying the place of the church doesn't just mean looking at its place in the physical landscape, but looking at the socio-political, ecclesiastical, and economic landscapes as well. Now, obviously, the first step in studying late medieval parish churches is you've got to find them. So how do you go about identifying late medieval church sites in the landscape? The easiest method is find the buildings, but unfortunately only some of the sites have surviving building remains, so we have to look beyond them. And that is where documentary evidence and place names come in. For us in the north, we have actually quite a wealth of documentary evidence. A lot of the records were stored in Armagh Cathedral rather than in forecourts in Dublin, so they didn't go up in flames. So we have a number of archbishop registers for the province of Armagh that were stored in the cathedral from the 14th to 16th centuries, which contain all sorts of information, such as who was the rector of a certain church, to naming another rector who travelled to Rome to talk to the Pope because the Archbishop favoured a different rector instead of him. There are an awful lot of Irish rectors who go to the Pope and complain about things. It's quite amazing. But it shows that the Irish Church was not in isolation, they were talking to the Pope. On top of the documentary evidence from the Archbishop registers, we've got tax records. And none of you looked overjoyed about the thought of tax. But bear with me, these tax records are much more interesting than most. There was a kind of church-wide tax across Europe in the late 1200s, organised by Pope Nicholas II. And in 1306, we have the records finalised for Ireland. Now, it doesn't record every single church in our study area, but it is the most comprehensive documentary list of church sites in Ireland for the time. And then the final form of evidence we have are place names, which are especially helpful when there aren't any building remains or documents surviving. So the townlands we live in, the villages we drive through, their names can record a snapshot of history. So I've already mentioned Donaghcloney. We've also got the likes of Donaghmore, which is literally big church. Kill is the most common term for a church. As you've got Kilbrony in County Down is Bronach's church. Another common form is Lan, such as in Marilyn or Machra Lan, which means the Church of the Plain. So pulling all of these strands of evidence together, I came up with this, which is 473 definite late medieval church sites, plus another 302 possible late medieval church sites. So yeah, I finished with a database of nearly 800 sites, which was more than I expected, and if I'd known this was how many I was going to come up with, I might have picked a smaller study area 4 years ago. On the bright side, this is arguably the most comprehensive database of late medieval church sites in the north of Ireland to date. So the first conclusion of my PhD was quite simple. There are a lot of parish churches in late medieval Ireland. But as you can see from the map, they're not built everywhere. There are very few churches in the more mountainous areas, like the Sperrins or the Glens of Antrim. And yeah, there are a lot more churches built on lower ground. But to really understand where the churches are, it's helpful to look at a few case studies. So we'll start with Armagh Archdiocese, which in the medieval period was kind of split into two parts called Armagh inter Hibernicus and Armagh inter Anglicus, which were basically the Irish bit and the English bit. The English part, Armagh inter Anglicus, is the southeastern part, which is basically County Louth. And as you can see, there's an awful lot of churches there. This is where you need to remember that there were a lot more parishes in eastern areas compared to western areas. That's one of the reasons why there are a lot more churches there. some of the churches or parishes in Louth are kind of maybe 6, 10 townlands, whereas the ones in the Irish parts can be 20, 30, maybe even 50 townlands. You've also got in Louth kind of generally low-lying, fertile ground, and Louth was one of the kind of areas heavily settled by the Anglo-Normans. The exception to kind of loads of churches in Louth is the Cooley Peninsula, which is the little mountainous bit sticking out, where we have only a few churches, and that's probably because you're not going to build a church on a mountain if you can help it. Now, by contrast, we've got larger parishes in the Irish bit of Armagh, which means kind of fewer churches, although we do have a little cluster just west of Lough Neagh, which probably represents greater population there. And if we move to Dromore Diocese, which is kind of roughly western County Down, we have the nice, neat situation of one church per parish in most cases, which is very nice. There are a couple of parishes which currently only contain possible church sites, which means that I'm hoping with a little bit more research into them and some better dating evidence, I can change those to definite church sites, because it would be very strange to have a parish with no church in it. What is interesting about Dromore Diocese is that a lot of the churches are situated near the parish boundaries rather than being in the middle of the parishes, and it's a trend that we also get in Raphoe Diocese up in County Donegal. The churches are situated near the parish borders. So what does this tell us? It probably demonstrates that the parishes may have reflected political territories, and that church sites were a means of marking the boundaries between different territories. And it's also a much more pronounced trend in Gaelic areas compared to the Anglo-Norman areas, which suggests that churches in Gaelic society had an element of liminality about them, whereas they were much more visibly central in Anglo-Norman culture. Now, looking at the church buildings and sites themselves, evidence from Armagh, Clocher and Down dioceses suggests that churches were built usually on slightly higher ground in the local area. Now, yes, there are 20 churches which weren't on any sort of height, particularly in the English part of Armagh diocese, but there are a notable number of churches situated on higher ground, such as local heights or on kind of a hilltop in the local area. So although it's not universal, there is a tendency for medieval churches to be built on higher ground. An elevation naturally does give a sense of prominence in the landscape, which would be added to by the fact that these churches would have been the only stone buildings in the landscape apart from castles. And the construction of churches on heights of some sort may have been intended to mirror the walks of ancient worshippers and create a sense of moving closer to heaven and thus closer to God. So that's a little look at where the churches are built. What about the buildings themselves, their size and form? Well, most of the churches and chapels are your standard rectangular building, albeit of different sizes. We have everything from buildings less than 10 metres long, such as St John's Point in County Down, to those well over 20 metres long, such as Kildamock Church in County Louth, which is 30.32 metres in length. And Kildamock is a very interesting church in its own right. In its local area, it's known as the Jumping Church. Why? Because the wall jumped. Genuinely, you are looking at the wall foundation and then the wall behind it. There are two different local traditions about what happened. One is that a severe storm in 1715 lifted the wall and deposited it as it now stands. I didn't really believe that until Storm Éowyn happened and I saw that happening with other buildings, and I'm now going, that could be the case. The other explanation is that they were trying to bury an excommunicated person inside the western wall of the church, and so as soon as that person was buried, the wall jumped so that they wouldn't actually be inside the church after all. I don't really know what the truth is, though as I said, Storm Éowyn did prove that the storm theory could be true, but you can make up your own minds as to what you think about it. So we're talking about church size. What factors might have affected the size of a church building? No doubt the number of parishioners in the area played a role, but I think money might also have come into it. So we have record evaluations for most churches from the 1306 ecclesiastical taxation, and using it, one of the things I was looking at was comparing the size of church buildings to their taxable wealth. Now, I have to admit, there isn't always a pattern. As you can see in County Down, there is literally no correlation whatsoever, so it wasn't very helpful. Dromore Diocese, however, shows a little bit of a trend between buildings and wealth, that kind of the larger the building, the greater the taxable wealth. Now, I admit 5 churches is not a large sample, but we do find the same thing in Connor Diocese. There are a couple of exceptions, but broadly speaking, the larger churches had higher valuations in the 1306 taxation. I'm not saying wealth was the only factor in a church's size, but I think it does have to be considered. Now, the eagle-eyed among you may have noticed that this graph excludes an outlier. This is because the outlier in question is both the largest church building in the diocese and the wealthiest by a long shot. It's the little dot away over there. Let me introduce you to Ballywillan Church on the outskirts of Portrush. It's a well-preserved roofless ruin with a door in the north wall, 3 open windows and 4 blocked windows, originally constructed in the 13th century. In the 1306 taxation, the church is valued at £25, 4 shillings and 8 pence, or a grand total of 6,056 pence if you want to plot it in Excel, because Microsoft unfortunately doesn't understand pounds, shillings and pence. To place this in context, the next highest valued churches are all kind of around 11 to 13 pounds, so this church is double the valuations. And as I said, it's the largest surviving church ruin in the diocese, plus it has the greatest number of windows of any surviving church building in the diocese. And why does that matter? Well, the windows in this church are all made with sandstone, which is a more expensive stone type. More windows required more money. Ballywillan was a church building with money spent on it, and money given to it by tithes from the local community. Now, the area at the north coast did fall within the earldom of Ulster in the 13th century, so it is possible that this brought greater economic prosperity to the area and enabled the people living there to invest more in their church. Although it's also possible that the Earl just wanted to show off some of his wealth and so built a very big church building to get some extra spiritual points. Now, as I said, the 1306 taxation records record most of the churches in existence in 1306, and they give us a general idea of where the taxable wealth was in the north of Ireland. So as you can see, the main areas with the bigger taxable wealth are at the north coast, southeast of Connor Diocese, and kind of north and east down, which are all areas that were firmly within the earldom of Ulster in the 13th and early 14th centuries. In other words, English settlement brought with it a different type of economy, one that had surplus wealth that could be taxed. This isn't to say that Gaelic areas were poor, but they had a different economy, one that wasn't as easily taxable by assessors from England or elsewhere in Europe. And it also means that kind of the parish churches across the north of Ireland weren't all situated within the same economic landscape, and so we can't assume that tithes were always paid in coins either. For instance, there's a wonderful document noting that the Bishop of Derry was to pay his dues to the Archbishop of Armagh in eels, 200 of them, which I'm not entirely sure how he got them all down to Armagh, but obviously he managed. So by studying the medieval churches in Ireland, we can find out more about the economy of the time as well. And it's not simply a case of English rich and Irish poor, but it's rather 2 different economic systems that suited those who used them. Now, the 1306 taxation, although our best form of economic evidence, isn't our only source for the north of Ireland. We also have what's called Dianitas Hiberniae, which is a collection of 14th and 15th century annate records, which were basically taxes due to the Pope on certain churches. They don't apply to every church. I'm not really sure how the Pope picked which churches in Ireland he took taxes from, but he did. The other disadvantage of these records is that they are in Latin, so my Latin has significantly improved in the last 4 years. Like, comparing these records with the 1306 taxation, we can notice a couple of very interesting things about the changing economy in the north. And the first relates to the churches in the east, in the areas that started off in the earldom of Ulster, but were then affected by the decline of English settlement there. So we've got Carrickfergus, which is the blue dots in the graph on the left, and then Kilkeel, which is the graph on the right. Carrickfergus starts off in the 1306 taxation being very wealthy, but as you can see, it actually decreases in taxable value over the course of a century, and Kilkeel's valuations fluctuate. They don't show any discernible trend, which is very interesting when we compare them to churches from Gaelic dioceses. We've got Clonca and Tochboyne are both in County Donegal, but in Derry and Raphoe diocese respectively. And you can see that both of them actually experience a significant increase in their taxable wealth between the 14th and 15th centuries. So while the accessible economy in the English areas kind of stalled or diminished, the Gaelic economy grew. And this increase is probably connected with both the Gaelic economy adapting more of a surplus producing perspective, but we've also got Atlantic fishing economy and more of a trade network in Atlantic areas that Gaelic lords such as the O'Donnell and Donegal were able to take advantage of. So Gaelic lords and English elite interacted with the economy, they were affected by its ups and downs, but how did they interact with the local parish churches specifically? And did other figures like the archbishops or monastic abbots? Well, looking at church patronage is a means of finding out. Now, I don't know exactly what you think of when you hear the term church patronage, but in the medieval context, it meant someone who had the right to nominate the rector of a church. And if you search for academic works about church patronage, most of what you'll get is from England and focused on lordly patronage, i.e., the local lord gets to nominate the rector of the local church, although the church did put in a little note saying that the bishop had to approve, so the lord couldn't nominate just anybody. So I had a look to see what sort of things I could find on church patronage in Ireland, and I started with Connor Diocese. These were the results. As you can hopefully see from the map, the local lords aren't actually all that involved with the patronage of parish churches. What we do have, however, is an awful lot of monastic involvement. May I introduce you to something called monastic appropriation? For something that is quite significant in the medieval church, it's almost entirely ignored in scholarship writings to date. You see, 46% of the churches in Connor are appropriated to a monastery. Now, appropriation is not exactly the same as patronage. The key difference is that the monastery appropriating a parish church became the rector of that parish church with the right to the tithes that the rector would normally receive, which is about 2/3 of the total tithe income. The monastery then had the responsibility of appointing a vicar who would serve the parishioners and conduct the services in the parish. This is a big deal for several reasons. One of the big ones being that in the 12th century, the Irish Church went through a period of reform and accomplished two key things, repeatedly anyway. One was the establishment of the fixed ecclesiastical territories, the dioceses and later parishes. The second was the separation of the monastic church and the parochial church. Most people say that that separation was successful until the friars came along and started preaching in parish churches. I disagree. As you can see, the monastic church was much more involved with parish churches than most people seem to realise. And in case you're wondering, it's not just Connor. We have the case in Armagh Interanglicus with a lot of monasteries appropriating churches. We have it in Down Diocese, and we have it in Clogher. Let me flick back to Down for a moment, where you can see from the sheer list of things involved that it's not just one monastery doing the appropriating. Every single monastery in Down Diocese, plus one from Connor, are appropriating parish churches in this diocese. The separation of the monastic church and the parochial church did not happen. They have a change in relationship, yes, but they didn't separate. But monastic appropriation doesn't affect every church in the diocese. So why are some appropriated and others not? I have to admit, no offence to the monasteries, but my first thought was money. Appropriate the wealthier churches, you get more money. So I went to Connor Diocese and plotted every single church kind of based on what their appropriation type was and what their valuations in the 1306 taxation was. And these are the results. Hopefully you can see the different coloured dots on the screen. But as it shows you, there's not really a difference in the wealth of churches appropriated to the monasteries and churches that aren't. The only single pattern is that the wealthiest churches tend to be under the patronage of the Earl of Ulster, but he kind of had the greatest wealth in the area, so that's maybe not surprising. What it does suggest is that monasteries either weren't tempted by the wealth of the churches, or what I think is more likely is that they didn't have free choice in which churches were appropriated to them. So with wealth dismissed as a factor, I took Connor again and plotted all of the churches and the monasteries they were appropriated to on the map. And I think this starts giving us some clues about why certain churches were appropriated. So we've got 9 churches appropriated to Muckamore Abbey, which is the pink X on the very southwest of the diocese. We have 5 of the churches appropriated to it are all kind of in the same part of the diocese, all quite close to Muckamore Abbey. Kells, which is the black X, kind of just north of Muckamore, has one church right beside it and 2 others that are very close. And Coleraine, which is in the northwest part of the diocese, the lovely green X, has its appropriated church in the same part of the diocese. So I think that proximity to the monasteries was one consideration in which churches were appropriated to them and which weren't. The next question to ask is, what did parishioners think of monastic appropriation. Did they notice it? Did it affect their lives? Yes, it did, but not for the right reasons. In 1411, the Archbishop of Armagh has to intervene with the Hospitallers, or the Knights Hospitallers of St John's of Jerusalem, appropriation of Carlingford Church and take the rectory ties away from them because they didn't repair the eastern part of the church, which was their duty as the rectors of the church. And in 1430, the Hospitallers are in trouble with the Archbishop again, this time over Kildamock Church, because they weren't providing enough of an income for the vicar. The Archbishop basically had to threaten the prior of the Hospitallers to increase the vicar's wage, or the Archbishop would tell him exactly how much he had to pay the vicar. So both times, the Hospitallers failed in their duties as the appropriating monastery, and this adversely affected the parishioners. In Carlingford, their church building was damaged and in need of repair, and in Kildamock, they didn't have a vicar to conduct the services for a time because the monastery wouldn't pay enough. It's not just affecting people in the English part of Armagh. We have Derrynoose in the Irish part of Armagh, where the parishioners themselves have to go and complain to the Archbishop about the situation in their parish. The culdees of Armagh were taking far more of the church tithes than they should have done, leaving the vicar unable to perform his role as a vicar because he just couldn't survive on no money. A document from 1430 shows that the parishioners argued that the vicarage income was so poor no one would accept the position of vicar, that the care of souls in their parish was sorely neglected, and that this was a notorious fact in neighbouring parishes. Basically, don't go to Derrynoose, you won't have any help. So this document tells us that although monastic appropriation was supposed to work smoothly, with monasteries being the rectors, monasteries providing the vicar, it didn't really work that way in practice. It seems that the monasteries didn't always care for the spiritual welfare of others, especially parishioners. Now, monastic appropriation isn't the only circumstance in which we find monastic church and parochial church rather more entwined than they theoretically should be. We go to Killeavy in County Armagh, is a beautiful church site on the slopes of Slieve Gullion. It's a late medieval parish church and an Augustinian nunnery at the same time. The site itself has two church buildings, an early medieval stone church and immediately east of it a 15th century building. From what I can tell, my best guess is that the 15th century building was the parish church and the nunnery used the earlier Western church. Unfortunately, no other nunnery buildings survive, so we can't confirm it for sure, but we do know from documents that it functioned as both parish church and nunnery, although curiously in the 1306 taxation, it's only listed as a parish church. But it is yet another example of the local church and the monastery being closer than one might first expect. So hopefully this has given you a flavour so far of the wealth of knowledge and the interesting things we can discover about late medieval churches and life in medieval Ireland more broadly. Now, having talked about the late medieval church buildings, their location, patronage, wealth, I want to finish with one other aspect of these churches. Sorry. You see, there's something of a dichotomy in Irish church studies. You either study churches from 400 to 1100 AD, or you study churches from 1200 to the 16th century, and never the twain shall meet. Now, while I am mainly falling into the latter category, looking at churches from 1200 onwards, I am interested in when these church sites came into being, in their origins. Are they new foundations in the 12th and 13th centuries, or are they sites that have existed for hundreds of years? I'm going to take two dioceses to illustrate some of my findings and the impact that I think the Anglo-Norman or English arrival had on the ecclesiastical landscape. So as I said, kind of going back to our three forms of evidence for identifying church sites: the archaeological evidence, documentary records, and place names. Now with place names, you do have to be a little bit careful when looking at the origins of church sites. There are two ecclesiastical place names, Temple and Eglish, that apply specifically to post-12th century churches, and so they don't apply to the early medieval church sites. Other ecclesiastical name forms like Donna and Kill are the names to look out for. So we start with Dromore Diocese first. We have 20 definite late medieval church sites here. Now this is not me saying that these are all the ecclesiastical sites that ever existed in Dromore. These are just the definite late medieval ones. I tried to find early medieval evidence for them and concluded that 14 of these church sites started as ecclesiastical sites in the early medieval period. Fun fact, Donathoni is probably one of the earliest, along with Donatmore, both of the Donna element that is applied to churches from the 5th to 7th centuries. We've also got churches with the kill element, such as Kilbrony, which is the triangle down at the bottom. And we've also got sites such as Tullylish, which doesn't have an ecclesiastical place name, but it does have an early ecclesiastical enclosure and is mentioned in an early medieval martyrology. So in Dromore, which is one of the Gaelic dioceses, we have 70% of the late medieval church sites being founded in the early medieval period, and only 30% that are seen to be new foundations in the late medieval period. If we move to Connor Diocese, on the other hand, only 32 of the 78 church sites in this diocese have early medieval origins. That's just 41%. And if you look at the map, you'll notice that the diamonds, which indicate churches without early medieval origins, so churches that seem to be founded in the late medieval period, are particularly prevalent in the northwest of the diocese and in the south and the east, which are all areas where the earldom of Ulster was dominant in the 13th century. So it seems, therefore, that the arrival of the Anglo-Normans in the north led to a wave of new parish church foundations in Connor Diocese, whereas kind of the areas of this diocese that remained under more Gaelic control, which is particularly the southwest and the northeast in the Glens, they maintained their existing church sites and there are only a few new foundations there. So although these are only two case studies, it does suggest that the Anglo-Normans tended to found new church sites, whereas the Gaelic population tended to continue using the existing church sites from the early medieval period, building new stone churches on the sites of previous wooden churches. This isn't to say that the Anglo-Normans didn't adopt any early medieval ecclesiastic sites, they definitely did. Nendrum in County Down is one example. I'm sure at least some of you have been there, although I discovered to my horror that my mum has never been to Nendrum, so as soon as the weather improves a bit, I am taking her there, whether she wants to go or not. Nendrum is a very cool early ecclesiastical site. We've got the surviving round tower base, church ruins, the classic, beautiful early ecclesiastical enclosures. The one thing I don't like about Nendrum is that that's all that anybody ever talks about it. They're very much, it's an early medieval monastery, it's amazing, and I'm going, yes, it's an early medieval monastery, it's also a late medieval parish church, which is just as cool. And it was a functioning parish church up until at least 1400 AD. So there's more to Nendrum than you might think. The Anglo-Normans came, used the monastery, and adapted it to be a parish church. We've also got Rehope, also in County Down, as another early medieval church site that is used in the late medieval period. Oh, it's difficult to tell with this building kind of exactly when it was constructed and how it was adapted, because it was restored in 1916, and the person who did it, I'm not entirely sure I want to call him an archaeologist, because he did a very bad job of recording things, which is particularly annoying because this church had a surviving stone altar, which is now heavily restored, that was found to have a burial underneath. The man at the time, a man called Bigger, decided that this burial under the altar was St. Tassa, who the church is named after. Unfortunately, the skeleton is now missing, so we can't date it or determine its sex or tell if this person was from Ireland or not. So it seems that this will be one mystery that will have to remain for so, at least for the time being. The point is, the Anglo-Normans did use existing early ecclesiastical sites as well as founding a lot of new ones. And with some, they've definitely taken an existing early site but created a new building. Monaster Boyce is a good example of this. It's in County Louth, near the southern border of County Louth, and I recommend visiting it if you haven't been. It's also only a few minutes' drive from Mellifont Abbey, which is the earliest Cistercian abbey in Ireland, so just take a day trip to County Louth at some point. And I admit I also threw it in because I was at Monaster Boyce doing survey work at sunset, and I got some really nice photos. So you're getting lots of photos of this site. There's a beautiful round tower, several lovely high crosses with some really interesting carvings that are worth a good look. But this site has two stone churches. One makes sense, the other doesn't. The North Church, which is the church in the right photo, is a lovely 13th century building. It's got a 13th century doorway, it's got a 13th century window, it's got a later doorway on the south wall. It's a nice, normal, medieval church building. The Southern Church, on the other hand, is complicated. It's both fascinating and frustrating. A lot of people in previous works have dated it as the 11th century because of its western doorway. The western doorway being the tiny little doorway you can see in the left-hand photo. The doorway that no one can walk through. It is waist height. It's not unheard of for graveyard levels to rise over time as burials accumulate, but this would be a particularly extreme case. Added to this, that this church building is bigger than an 11th century church building normally would be, and we've got later doors and windows in the north and south walls, and you're hopefully beginning to understand why I call it complicated and slightly frustrating. I highly doubt that people would have crawled through a doorway to enter a church, but I can't really explain why the western doorway is the height it is, unless someone was updating or restoring the church at some point and they took out the western doorway and then only put half of it back, but that seems highly unlikely as well. So this is another puzzling site that will involve a bit more research. But setting the puzzle aside, the archaeological remains of this site indicate that it was an important early medieval monastic site, and it continued to be an important parish church site with having not one but two stone church buildings at it. It remained in use by its parishioners as their church and a communal centre in the late medieval period, which in a way brings us back to where we started with HERoNI, another early medieval ecclesiastical site which continued as a late medieval church building. So I'd like to finish this in a slightly unusual way with a quote from a science fiction series that I'm fond of. It's a standard science fiction episode with a mysterious object arriving. The most intelligent character gathers a team of people to study it and says, right, we can't make assumptions on what this is. As soon as she's finished speaking, one of the military scientists says, so obviously it's a type of weapon. Our wonderful intelligent character gives him a very pointed look and says, that's an assumption. Over the course of my PhD, I've had to give myself quite a number of pointed looks and reminders not to make assumptions about the late medieval Irish Church or the society it operated in. I've acknowledged today my totally wrong assumption that churches were appropriated based on their wealth. We've seen that this wasn't the case. I made the assumption of believing that all the scholars of the 12th century church were right when they wrote that the parish church and the monastic church became separate after the reforms. We've seen from the evidence that that didn't really happen. Perhaps my most forgivable assumption over the course of the PhD was made 5 years ago when I was planning it and picking my study area. 7 dioceses is quite a large area, but I picked it because I thought that I would need that size of study area to have enough data to have enough church sites to work with, and I've now got a database of nearly 500 of them. So you can see that there is so much more to the late medieval parish church in Ireland than meets the eye. So the next time you're driving through a village or a townland with an ecclesiastical place name, why don't you have a look and see if you can find an old graveyard? Why not explore the graveyard and see what you can find? You might be surprised by what's there, but hopefully you've seen from this that whatever you do find in the old graveyard is only the tip of the iceberg. Just quick acknowledgements to Northern Bridge for giving me money to do the PhD, and my supervisors, Paddy Gleeson, Simon Egan and Sparky Booker, and a massive thank you to HERoNI and their staff for the numerous email inquiries that they have responded to, and the various people, most especially my parents, who have held tape measures at church sites. If anyone's interested in making the maps or asking me how I did the maps, all of these sources are freely accessible online, and the documents are in the library at Queen's. So are there any questions as I finish with lovely pictures of some more churches?